Welcome to Secrets of the Marshall One-Wire Mod. How to turn your amp from dud to stud. If you're new to the channel, that's the kind of video you might be expecting. This is not going to be that kind of video. This is going to go into the actual details of what the One-Wire Mod is, what it does, how it works, its strengths, its weaknesses, and how the technician or designer can adjust different parameters to get the results the player wants, including the fact that when you make changes to channel 1, it affects channel 2 and vice versa. It's a big balancing act. All these things work together in concert, and that can give you great results, or the whole thing can crash and burn. So let's walk that tightrope together. Now, a quick note, there's not going to be any playing in this video. That's going to be the next video where you get to hear what this all sounds like once the changes are finalized. If I don't do this kind of video first, the actual playing video is going to get so many comments saying, why did you do that? How did you do that? And how do I get that? So if you're interested in this, please watch this whole video. If it's over your head, that's fine. There are lots of videos on this channel where it doesn't get this technical. If you want to do this kind of change to your Marshall and you don't understand everything that you're about to see later in this video, you need to do some more work before you dive in and make changes to a Marshall. Start with a tube screamer, start with a champ. Understand the basics of how circuits work before you make modifications to a very complicated amp where a lot of things can go wrong. That's not me being an elitist or a snob. That's me trying to save you heartache and to save your amplifier from well-intentioned mistakes. First of all, the elephant in the room. Why am I making any changes to this limited edition Randy Rhoads amp at all? When the amp first came in, it had four main issues. First of all, it had a faulty heater balance circuit, which is very common in the 1959 Super Lead Marshall reissue. Second of all, this amp had a bad gain pot, by which I mean that the wiper was losing contact with the trace in the pot. So you went from zero volume to all the volume and nothing in between, and it was noisy. The amp also had a third issue, which was a bad cathode connection. This yellow wire here was just sitting inside a soldered joint. It was not actually soldered, and that was intermittent and causing a lot of instability issues. The fourth issue, which is going to be the case in all Randy Rhoads model tribute amps, because of the way they implemented the one-wire mod in these Randy Rhoads amps, there was a much longer than necessary wire run connecting the wiper of channel 1's gain pot to the grid of V1B, the second channel's triode. And when you have a high gain amp, and this is the very definition of a high gain amp, you want to keep everything as short as possible. You want to use shielded wires when you cannot. In stock form, this had a very long run using unshielded wire, and that also caused instability and high noise. What I did to fix the really long wire run was simple. Since it's going from the wiper of the channel 1 gain pot to the input grid leak junction for channel 2, and they're physically close to each other, I just changed the orientation, the placement of this jack, which put the 68K grid stopper junction from channel 2's input right by the volume pot, the gain pot for channel 1. So then we could do a short connection with a resistor, as short as possible, no need for shielding. Now, everything that I have done, and everything I'm going to tell you that I have done beyond that, and everything I plan to do, has been done with the goal of being reversible. This is a collectible amp, so nothing I'm doing cannot be easily undone in about 20 minutes worth of work by a good tech. The owner doesn't really care about it being collectible. He got a good price on it, apparently. He does care about it being a really good sounding amp. So he asked if I could make this amp less bright. I'll show you the stock bright cap that's in this amp in a moment. I removed it temporarily, and I think it's a little too smooth, but at this point, the amp is sounding healthy, and it's a good basis on which to build. So let's talk about what's happening in the stock circuit before we talk about any changes beyond that point. I'm about to dive in here and talk about the actual circuit with the actual schematic showing as it came in, as it is now, and where it's going to be. Before I do that, I think I need to mention, for those of you who really know how these things work, there are three factors that I am not addressing, or at least not addressing in full in the subsequent minutes. Number one, it's how changing the load of a triode's stage affects the gain and behavior and response of that triode. With my calculations, the changes don't really change the load that much, so it's not really a factor here. Second, I'm not really going to get into high-pass filters because Marshall used 22 nanofarad coupling caps, 1 meg volume pots, and even when you have things in parallel with the wiper to ground, as happens in the schematic as you'll see, the high-pass frequency never gets above 20 hertz. It's just not going to be a factor. If I were changing things in the cathodes, if I were changing the values of coupling caps, then that could be a consideration. As it doesn't really affect anything in this circuit, I did not address that. And third, while I talked about the loading on a pickup, depending on different input circuits that you'll find in the rest of this video, I ignored the very slight voltage divider differences that those same networks form because, according to my calculations, you're losing either 3% of possible gain from your guitar or 7% of possible gain from your guitar. Both channels have enough gain to spare that's fairly negligible. It's real, and it can be a factor in other circuits, certainly. But in this case, it was such a minor thing, I thought it was distracting and the video was just getting too long. So let's dive into the real stuff. So here's the schematic for the Marshall Randy Rhoads Tribute amp, which is pretty much the textbook early implementation of the, quote, one-wire mod. I'm showing it from the input as far as the cathode follower stage, which drives the tone stack. From that point on, it's straight 1959 super lead. Notice that I'm not showing input jacks for either channel here. Instead, I'm showing you what actually happens in the circuit when a guitar is plugged in. We're going to start with the higher gain channel 1 inputs. Instead of showing input jacks, I show a pickup, and then a guitar volume. I show the guitar volume turned up to 10. And all that is in parallel with the 1 meg grid leak on the input. Now, I just show pickup, I just show guitar volume. Later, we'll talk about single coil versus humbucker, 250K versus 500K guitar volumes, and how those interact with each channel in their operation. But for now, know that I'm just showing that there is a pickup and a guitar volume, we're ignoring the tone circuit, connected to the input of this channel 1. From there, it goes through a 34K grid stopper, which is the 268Ks in parallel when you use the high gain input. And then they have a 1K2 resistor mounted right at the grid of V1A. The cathode is the 820 330 microfarad that you find in the normal channel of a 59 super lead. It has a 100K plate resistor. It has a 22 nanofarad coupling cap going to a 1 meg audio taper pot. And all that is straight out of the stock 1959 super lead normal channel. The wiper of that pot goes to a 470K resistor. But instead of going to the junction with the other channel's 470K resistor, as you'd find in the 1959 super lead, they have it going straight to the second grid of V1, V1B. Now notice here I show that going through a 1K2 resistor and then through a 34K resistor to ground. That's because nothing is plugged into the channel 2 inputs, which means that the 34K, which is those 268Ks in parallel with each other, because nothing is plugged into the channel 2 input in this instance, which means that the 268K resistors on the channel 2 inputs are in parallel, so you're 34K away from ground. That 470K resistor going straight to the grid on the other side of the 1.2K resistor there, that was the very long unshielded wire that they had in the stock amp. And it will go to a slightly different place in a minute, but for now we're going to show it there. The remainder of this circuit, which is now the channel 2, if you want to think of it that way, was the high treble channel. So you've got the 2K7 and the 680 nanofarad cathode, another 100K plate, another 22 nanofarad coupling cap, another 1 meg audio taper pot. It had a 4.7 nanofarad bright cap across it, and then it went to a 470K resistor bypassed by a 470 picofarad cap. And in a standard 1959 super lead, that would be where the previous channel's 470K would go. In this case, it's going straight to the grid of V2A. And you can see it's got the 100K plate resistor, it's got the 820 ohm cathode unbypassed in this case, The plate goes to the grid of V2B, 100K cathode resistor, standard Marshall cathode follower, then goes to the tone stack. But what happens if you don't plug into channel 1 and you plug into channel 2 instead? So here's what it looks like when you're plugged into channel 2. Again, we have your pickup in parallel with its guitar volume pot, in parallel with the 1 meg grid leak in the stock circuit. And after that, it goes through the parallel 68K resistors, through the 1K2 to the grid of V1B. At that point, everything is stock 1959 super lead, except we also have that 470K going to that grid. Now, when you're using channel 2, you would want to turn down the volume from channel 1. Otherwise, you'd be mixing in hiss at all times. So that 470K in this case is actually going to ground, which means that there is an additional path to ground in parallel with your guitar volume and that 1 meg. So you got 34K, 1K2, 470K, that adds up to 505.2K. And that's added to the loading that's already on your guitar. And what that means is if you are using single coils, the addition of that 470K resistor to ground increases the loading on your pickup by 22.69%. If you're using a humbucker, it increases the loading by 26.5%. That's quite an increase. You really want to load your pickups as little as possible. Everyone knows the benefits of that by now. People pay extra money for a 500K pot that actually measures higher than that. This is one of the sneaky ways that amps can mess with your sound and you're unaware of it. Now, what does that all mean for the player? It depends quite a bit. If you're the kind of player who never turns down your guitar volume, you may not mind it so much. The sound will have a little less high end in the amp, but you just turn the tone controls, turn the treble up, the presence up, whatever you want to do. If you're the kind of player, though, who turns their guitar volume down, then the loading on the pickup will change dramatically as you go to lower gain settings on your guitar, and the amp can get really bright as a result because the loading changes drastically. It's not a make or break kind of thing. It's not necessarily a deal breaker, but it's something to be aware of. And when you're designing these amps, you want to tweak it so that it has a certain response to the player, to the playing dynamics, and to the volume pot of a good guitar. So that 470K is something to be played around with. Let's talk about changes that I already made to this circuit. And remember, the goal here is for all these changes to be reversible. We're going to start with the changes I made to channel 2. So you'll see that it still has the pickup in parallel with the guitar volume, in parallel with the 1 meg resistor. But we have both changed that 470K to a 1 meg, and we've moved that junction ahead of the 1.2K because we're no longer running a wire all the way to the grid of V1B. We're running the wire right to the input jack. So that is a great change. It means that you're going to have a lot less length, a lot less susceptibility to noise, and the grid stopper, the 1.2K, right at the grid is doing its job. What does this mean for your response as far as changing the load on your guitar? From going from 470K to 1 meg, it means that instead of having a 22.69% increase in load with single coils, that goes down to a 12.97 increase in load over not having that joined there. With humbuckers, it goes from 26.5% increase in load to a 16.25% increase in load. So that's a significant improvement as far as loading the guitar less just by changing that 470K to a 1 meg. More on that in a moment. Going back to the changes that I've made on channel 2, the only other change I made was I lifted out that 4.7 nanofarad bright cap because the owner thought it was too bright. We're going to revisit that in a moment. But before we do that, we need to talk about what happens to channel 1 when we change that 470K to 1 meg. So now we're back to channel 1 with the guitar plugged into it, and everything is the same up into the output of the gain pot for that channel. Now, instead of going through a 470K resistor, we're going through a 1 meg resistor. And that 1 meg resistor then has a 34K resistor to ground. And that also makes a voltage divider. It's the same voltage divider that affects the input, just reversed. Now, 470K in the stock version, followed by 34K, has now changed into 1 meg and 34K. In stock form, as this amp comes from the factory, the 470K and 35.2K divider gives you 7.5% of the possible gain from channel 1 feeding channel 2. And that seems pretty drastic. That's a drastic reduction right there. And it is, except that the output of channel 1, even reduced to 7.5% of its possible gain, is louder than the signal coming from your guitar. With this mod, with the 1 meg and 34K, that only gives you 3.4% of the possible gain of the preceding stage. Again, that's louder than the input signal of your guitar, but we are losing a significant amount of gain in channel 1 by going to a 1 meg. We'll talk about that in a moment. Other than that, the rest of it is as you just saw. We don't have the bright cap on the second gain pot. So right now, as amp exists, I have lost some gain, some potential gain from channel 1 because I changed that resistor to 1 meg. That has given us a little bit more gain in channel 2. It has also given us a significant decrease in pickup loading on channel 2. That's a good thing. We have removed the bright cap. At this point, the amp is a little too smooth sounding. We're going to want to reintroduce a bright cap, possibly only on channel 2, possibly only on channel 1, possibly on both. We'll play around with the values. My thought is that it would be really nice to make channel 2 go from clean to a fairly vintage sounding Marshall Super Lead. Maybe with a bright cap, but not the 4.7 nanofarad stock, because that's just over the top. But then we want to make channel 1 be higher gain. We want it to be dripping with pinch harmonics. We want it to do a lot of things that channel 2 cannot do by itself, and we want it to have more gain than it has right now. Right now, it's not quite as much gain as we can get, and it's a little too smooth. In a perfect world, I would be changing the cathode values for channel 1. Remember, we're trying to keep the modifications minimal and easily reversible. I would love to lose some low end there. I would love to increase the value of the plate resistor there for some more compression. And I would love to put some capacitors in parallel with those plate resistors to prevent high frequency oscillation and keep things really stable so that I can increase the gain more. This is a good time to say that I've already spoken to the owner about this. And our plan is for me to do so much now and let him live with the amp for a while. And then at that point, if he wants more of this or less of that, to bring it back and we'll sit down, we'll order a pizza, we'll do things together. He can play it. He'll know when it's right. For now, though, I'm going to get to the point where it's going to be pretty darn close to right without making any radical changes to the existing circuit, and it all must be reversible. I'm not trying to turn this into a Friedman. He already has a Friedman. I am trying to make this a better realization of the one-wire mod. And all these things that I'm mentioning as considerations here would apply to you if you have it done to one of your Marshalls. So let me talk about some of the things that I might want to do next. So the question is, what's next? What's the next step without doing anything too radical? I already mentioned that I can use different value bright caps on the two channels. I put the bright caps on both, just one, just the other. I'll play around with that, get it dialed in just right so that channel 2 does the vintage Marshall stuff. It'll still have a clean, it'll have plenty of attitude and snarl, but it does, the traditional super lead sounds. And channel 1 is the real gain monster with all the pinch harmonics dripping off it and all that fun stuff. Now, in order to do that, without sacrificing the sound of channel 2, I kind of made a step backwards from as far as the gain possible from channel 1 goes by doing that 1 meg resistor, which now has a 34K to ground, as you saw. But if I were to disconnect one of the 68K resistors from the low gain input jack of channel 2, that would give me 68K to ground rather than 34K to ground. And that gives me a pretty good increase in gain for channel 1 without affecting channel 2, with the exception that you could not use the low gain input jack. More on that in a moment. But if I were to do that, so 1 meg 68K voltage divider rather than 1 meg 34K, it takes us from having a 96.6% gain reduction to only a 93.2% gain reduction. So, that's a 3% gain increase. If that doesn't prove to be enough, then I have another trick, which will leave both inputs as is on channel 2. So channel 2 would be unaffected, and we still have less loading on the pickup there. But I could increase the lower resistor value in that voltage divider to anything I wanted to when you're only using channel 1. For instance, right now with the stock 34K, we're getting a 96.6% reduction.
68K gives 93.2. If I were to use a higher value resistor there, 254K gives 74%. 504K gives 49.6%. So I can buy back a lot of gain by increasing the value of the lower resistor in that voltage divider for channel 1 without affecting channel 2 at all. Now the issue is it's very possible to have too much gain. And I see a lot of beginning amp builders overgain their stages. You need to have some reduction, otherwise you just get square wave nasties. So once I find what sets the sound coming from channel 1 the way I want it, then maybe that I need to have a little more gain coming in there and sacrifice a little gain in channel 2. It's also possible that, hey, just don't turn the channel 2 gain up above 3 o'clock if you're using the channel 1 gain at higher settings. It's always a compromise with these things. We're going to play around with it. I'm pretty sure I can get it just right, but that's the kind of thing I can fiddle with math, or I can just install some pots and turn things until I like the balance of things. When we're done, I want to get the signal coming out of channel 1 just right to drive the bejesus out of channel 2 and get the sound we're after without getting into oscillation or uncontrolled squeal. And I'm a little bit limited in that we're trying to make everything easily reversible. So I cannot change the value of the plate resistors. I cannot change the value of the cathode resistor and its bypass cap on channel 1. Not unless the owner says, go for it. But we're initially at least going to try to keep this pretty much stock Randy Rhoads, just with little tweaks. There are some things I could do. If I don't want to put a small value cap across the plate resistor to get rid of oscillation, I could add that similar capacitor from the plate to cathode at the tube socket, easily removed later, just to control oscillation, squeal, keep all the hiss down to a minimum. That's what I'm going to play around with in the next video. I think this is enough for today. Gives you a good idea of the behind the scenes calculations and how all the different factors interrelate and all the things that an amp tech or designer has to keep in their head at all times. What is the goal? If I change this, what happens to that? It's all interrelated. There's nothing exists in a vacuum here, and you have to have a very holistic approach to the entire circuit. And I don't mean drinking carrot juice or anything nonsense. I mean, you have to know that, hey, if I zig, it's gonna zag.